Hello, my name is Jim Turk, and I'm the director of the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson University. I'd like to begin today's session by acknowledging that the land on which I am speaking to you today is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaties signed by multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. On behalf of the Center for Free Expression at Ryerson University and today's event's co-sponsors, the Edmonton Public Library, the Thunder Bay Public Library, the Toronto Public Library, and the Vancouver Public Library, I want to welcome you. This is the fifth in the Center of Free Expression's In Conversation series, featuring prominent guests discussing important topics in the current political moment in which democracy is under threat, public discourse in vital matters is fragmented into self-affirming ideological bubbles when not discouraged altogether, and censorship is increasingly seen as an ally rather than an impediment to social justice. Our conversation today is with Vershawn Young. Vershawn has been writing for newspapers and magazines for almost 20 years. He is a solo performance artist as well as a professor of communications, race, gender, and literature, writing, and performance at the University of Waterloo. He is the author or co-author of 10 books, including the forthcoming This Ain't Yesterday's Literacy, Culture and Education After George Floyd. He regularly tours his one-man show titled after his book-length autobiographical study of Black identity. It's a pleasure and honor to have you with us today. Welcome, Vershawn. The title for today's discussion is Anti-Black Racism and Language. We are delighted that Vershawn will be in conversation with Awad Ibrahim. Awad is an award-winning author and a professor of education at the University of Ottawa. He is a curriculum theorist with special interest, among other things, in cultural studies, hip-hop, youth, and Black popular culture, social justice, diasporic and continental African identities, and applied linguistics. Awad has ongoing projects in Morocco, the United States, Sudan, and the United Arab Emirates. And it's in the United Arab Emirates that he'll be speaking with us today. So it's very late at night for him, and we're grateful that you're able to do this. He has written more than 100 publications and a number of books, including Black Immigrants in North America, essays on race, immigration, identity, language, hip hop, pedagogy, and the politics of becoming Black. Welcome, Awad. In terms of today's program, our format is going to be that after about 45 to 50 minutes of conversation with Vershawn, Awad is going to turn to the audience to bring you into the discussion. As you listen to their conversation, if you have a question at any point, if you look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. So feel free at any time during the conversation, if you have a question, click on that button, write down your question. And when Awad turns to the question part, the center's coordinator, Ange Holmes, will read out the first of the questions that has come in, and that process will carry on until we finish our event today at 3:30, at least 3:30 Eastern time. So if you do have a question, click on the Q&A tab at the bottom, write it down as you think of it, rather than waiting till the very end. Anyways, now it's time for our guests. I look forward to their conversation.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you so much, everybody. I know before anything and before we start anything, we need to, like Jim just did, I too need to pay homage to the land, to our Indigenous peoples, and to our African ancestors and their spirit who find themselves in the Americas, not by choice, but because of the Middle Passage and the some of us have been arguing that ongoing project of enslavement. On that note, not only am I more than thankful, but I have the absolute pleasure of kind of talking to my boy here, Vershawn, in a minute. I want to begin by thank you very, very much, Jim. Thank you, Ryerson. Thank you, the Center for Free Expression. And to Ange in particular. There is a name that you probably didn't hear about, Ange Holmes. For those of you who have organized sessions or organized events, you know how much time it takes to get things going, and the conversation, the work behind the scene. And so I just want to say hats off to the center, to Jim, and I don't mean to rub it in your faces, people, especially those of you who are in North America right now, but I'm in Dubai, and it's, I think it's 23 and it's 11 p.m., okay? And so that's why I have my t-shirt on, right? So trying to be funky here, right? It's beautiful, it's nice. Vershawn, my boy, it is your night, it's your day, and you are the man of the hour, and the only mission I have is to just give you the time and the space to introduce your thoughts, your ideas, and I have absolutely no doubt that it's going to be extremely productive, and seeing the number of people who are participating and joining the session, clearly there's something very attractive about the topic and about Vershawn Young as well, and the issues that you will be dealing with. And I know a lot of people in the audience have, I could even say, better things to do, yet you chose to be here. So we, Vershawn and I, want to be thankful that you are with us. And Vershawn, I have, just to get us going and until we have the audience with us, I have about 5 issues that 5 broad areas that I would love to hear your thoughts and ideas in them. And I want to begin by the autobiographical. And as you know, to use Stuart Hall's language, we're marked by history. We're marked by our lived experience. And of course, every experience is located in a time and a space. So some of us have been calling this the pedagogy of place, the pedagogy of locating ourselves in time and space, being critical, first of all, to locate ourselves in time and space, and being at the same time critical of the space where we locate ourselves. And here, the autobiographical, and I'm using here Bell Hooks' idea about the autobiographical here becomes almost our starting point, the ground upon which we build not only our lived experience, but we as academics, and I know in the audience, some of us, we don't have, not everybody in the audience is an academic, so we need to be kind of using broad terms. So the autobiographical here becomes the ground for our theorizing, for our scholarship as academics, for what we study, how we study it, and the conclusions we come up with. So having said that as a ground, I would love to provoke you to speak, and I'm being extremely provocative here, as an American citizen, and I'm using my word advisedly in this historical moment so that you locate this aspect, being American citizen. Add to it extremely important, not only important, but kernel, crucial, central, African American. So being American citizen, and even the idea that it's American and not a US citizen is something that I would love to hear your thoughts on. So being there and coming from that location, and yet teaching in Canada, how has it been your experience? How has it been your, how has being Canada with you? How is it treating you? Is it what we kind of mythologize it to be? Is it the land of the free in so many different ways? Is it the absolute paradise of multiculturalism? Well, I'd love to hear your thoughts about that.
Thank you, Awad. I can tell by the smile on your face that you already know the answer to that question or have some semblance of an answer. But before I begin in earnest to answer that question, let me begin by doing what I always do in a public setting, which is to offer a Black body acknowledgement. The Black body acknowledgement that I offer is modeled after the territorial acknowledgements, otherwise known as Indigenous and Native Peoples land acknowledgements. And these acknowledgements are often delivered before a public event as it was today. And those events sometimes happen in an institutional structure that's built on land that originally belonged to Native peoples in America and Canada. Land that was often violently sieged from the people to whom it rightfully belonged. The acknowledgements are also included as part of email signatures or on institutional websites. And the University of Waterloo, where I work, has such a territorial acknowledgement on its webpage. But for me, Awad, these territorial acknowledgements do not go far enough. They acknowledge the land, but not the rights of the people who own that land. In other words, no action usually accompanies these acknowledgements. No commitment to right the wrongs of stripping people from their land and the long-standing consequences that resulted and still result from such violent displacements. At the University of Waterloo, for instance, there is no simultaneous commitment to offer repayment to Native peoples in the form of free university tuition, for instance, or even at the basic level, an academic program or major in Indigenous studies. Nor is there any commitment to intervene into the racial injustice that still affects Native and Indigenous people. So for me, the territorial acknowledgements fall short when they do not also include elements that I encourage for Black body acknowledgements. Include a spoken active commitment to social justice, acknowledgement of ways that immediate changes can be made, and holding oneself and others accountable to call for and facilitate that change. So I offer this Black body acknowledgement. I was born in the USA. I currently live, teach, and research in Ontario, Canada. My spirit and breath activate a Black male body, one that is part of a race that is disproportionately maligned, surveilled, policed, jailed, and murdered in North America. I often cannot breathe, as Black men Eric Gardner and George Floyd said, respectively, on July 17, 2014 and May 25, 2020, before their lives were snuffed out by excessive police brutality. I make a commitment here today, within the scope of our conversation, to make breathing space for Black bodies as we move throughout structures of white supremacist capitalist patriarchy, as Black feminist Bell Hooks puts it. In other words, I try in this conversation, in this platform, to bring others together to discuss issues of social justice and to encourage them to gain greater insight into issues and to seek remedies. I hope our conversation helps clear space for Black breath by assisting educators in particular, but others in the public, to have difficult but informed and constructive conversations about race and social justice and allyship. I call upon educators and people in the public individually to seek ways that they can intervene into structures of oppression, perhaps, for example, by changing any negative or delimiting idea someone might have about others, especially Black people's linguistic varieties, Englishes, or accents that keep those varieties segregated from the mainstream. So in short, I make a commitment here and call upon others to join me to end our complicity and violence against Black peoples that occurs in culture, education, and in literacy. Now, to answer your question more directly, and you asked me about being an American and an African-American and living and working in Canada, and has Canada presented itself as the mythology suggests, a mythology of Canada being polite, or Canadians being polite, Canada being a sea of welcomeness and friendliness. And I would have to say that there is a huge tension between that mythology and the actual narrative that I live and experience in Canada. I often point to an example, Awad, that even though the United States and America is seen as an exemplary instance of racism, right? Even the recent insurrection that occurred at the Capitol is pointed to as an example of the kind of underbelly of racism that happens in America, and that Canada is somewhat different. My experience is different. And I often say that in the US, I was never referred to as the N-word in a derogatory sense by whites. Never, not once. Not to say that, that I'm absolving the US of racism. That can't happen, not yet. But I didn't experience being called a nigger in the US. It was only in Canada that I've been called a nigger several times, twice in a derogatory way, and a couple other times by whites seeming to want to be friendly. It seemed that they didn't understand that the cultural significance of the N-word is one that means that that's off limits in a sort of a interracial context of friendliness, that it's different. They didn't ask permission, they just used it. So I've been startled in Canada by the busting up against that myth that it's friendly and polite and welcoming, because my overall experience is that that is not the case. And I think some of the naivete that people either cultivate about that mythology, that Canadians tend to cultivate about that mythology, tends to increase, I think, the likelihood of negative racial interactions, because there is that naivete that exists.
I would love to know, why were you shocked? Why were you surprised about the? And this is why I'm bringing the autobiographical, because were you buying into the mythology before you arrived into Canada, or why were you shocked?
Yes, I bought into the mythology before I arrived. It's one of the reasons why I left.
Yeah.
Now, of course, I knew that I was coming into a predominantly white environment. But I had the idea that coming into this predominantly white environment would not have the same kind of racial overtones or kind of racial violence that I experienced in the States. So that's why I was surprised. But more on the use of the word, because my particular example, even though I experienced other forms of racism in Canada, which I can, if appropriate, I can bring up later. I'm locating it within the language of the N-word because recently I had had occasion to write about it, right? So last June, after the protests emanating from the George Floyd murder, my university issued a ban on the use of the N-word, and the ban came in the exact same week in which I was teaching a novel in which one of the characters is named Nigger Red, right? And the use of the N-word is in the novel. So when the university issued this blanket ban, I felt stuck. It had a real chilling effect on my teaching because I didn't know whether I should proceed or not. I also began to think, why would the university issue a ban on the N-word without consulting its Black faculty that use language? I mean, my first book is titled Your Average Nigga. So if they were going to issue a ban, you would think that they would consult their assets, that they would at least say there's a full professor on campus whose research squarely deals with the N-word. Let's at least talk to him. And it's not so find me. I mean, there's only about 5 of us on campus of 300, or more faculty. So being one of 5 with a research project that is undeniably specific to what they were doing, but yet the university issued this ban anyway, really chilled me. So I wrote an essay about it for the magazine, the scholarly mobilization magazine, The Conversation. Right. And then I wrote a piece about it in the Toronto Star. Now, when I wrote the piece in the Toronto Star, I received several emails from white men asking me why they can't use the N-word when I was saying Black people can use the N-word, but that whites couldn't. I also said, I should tell you, that teachers should be able to use the word when they are quoting from text. Right. In general conversation. And in fact, I'm a Black man that comes from a Black culture that uses the N-word in 6 or 7 different ways, none of them meaning the derogatory racial slur that came about, after the Enlightenment period or during the Enlightenment period to refer to Black people in dehumanized ways. None of the ways in which Black people use that word take that up. Right. Even though I'm a Black man that used the word, I do not use the word in conversation in the class because of multiple sensitivities, right? Among students, among my constituencies. I use it when we quote. I refer to it in general conversation as the N-word in that classroom context. But I'm giving you that to say, when the white males emailed me, my response, because their question was the same, why can't we use it? And my response was, well, it's really a disingenuous question. Because cultures have language patterns and use that other cultures do not adopt. Right. This to be true. For example, when some women use the B word in a positive sense, right? I was watching cable TV last night, some shows, and women were referring to themselves in this general way. But as a man, I can't go into that environment around all women, even if they're using it around. You don't want to do that. You don't want to. It's off limits in that way. But they were, and this was, my response did not settle the conversation, which was a little startling to me when I said a version of what I said to you. They wanted to come back. In other words, they were trying to change my mind about how they should be allowed to use the word. But I put it back on them to think, as you pointed out earlier, autobiographically, autoethnographically, about why it is that they have the desire to use the word, knowing its racial tenuous implications.
But Vershawn, I wanna kind of you just hit on something extremely significant, and maybe for the benefit of the audience as well. And I know you have lengthy history with the word. So if you can give two things. One, your main arguments, both in the Toronto Star piece and the conversation piece, but link that to the history of the word itself. If you can speak a little bit, just very briefly, and then I'm going to come back to this idea of the insider outsider.
Okay. Yeah, let me be succinct on that. So
okay.
I did try to rehearse my argument, but let me make it very short. The main argument is that the N word itself is not off limits to Black people. Black people should be able to use the word culturally, as well as the word should be able to be used in classrooms when referring to text. And when you take the word out of text, when you out of being able to be quoted in a classroom setting, you lose the point of literary references to the N word, which, as I said, about 6 or 7 different levels of meaning in Black culture. If you take the word out, you can't get that level of meaning.
Okay.
Even when it's used, those different levels of meaning, even used in a derogatory sense in a text, when you take the word out, you lose the force of the effect that it had on people who were called that term. We should be forced to deal with it. That's part of the educative process. The second part, however, is that educators, I think, have a real responsibility to be culturally sensitive and responsible, even as we carry out that work of bringing attention to derogatory terms or to culturally rich terms like the N word. That's the main argument. The history, as you asked, as you state, is one in which the term Niger historically from Latin really only referred to Black. That's it. It didn't have this hideous, heinous meaning that was assigned to it through the transatlantic slave trade and through slavery afterwards. So then the word was adopted just to dehumanize and to refer to Black people in a dehumanized manner. Black people took the word and began to use it in so many different ways, right? From a cultural standpoint. Now, the last argument or the last point to make about this is this. Black people share language patterns with the mainstream culture, or that's patterned after whites. We share that. But white people don't share the subculture language patterns and uses that Black people have because of white supremacy. Blackness doesn't operate in the same way. So they don't share that. Let me give you an example from language. I know you go to something else. But whites and Blacks can share a level of meaning on the word bad, for instance. If you say, that's a bad cup of coffee. Okay. We both know that that's unpleasant or undesirable or distasteful. Black people have several other meanings of the word bad, such as that's a bad suit, brother. Now,
there you go.
Bad suit doesn't mean distasteful or undesirable or unpleasant. It means that is extraordinary, that suit is really good looking, right? We also have we also use profanity in different ways. It's not the same way in which we share with white culture, for example, not to be too vulgar, but let's take the word shit, for example. You can say, man, that was some tough shit. It does not refer to defecation, not to be too unpleasant in my example, nor am I cussing you out. I am telling you, I am using shit in a Black cultural valence to refer to stuff or the event, right? But to give it a heightened understanding.
And it's really interesting that your shirt would say "too proud to code switch." I know. I could see the audience. I'm a hip hop scholar, right? So I could see the audience snapping their fingers, man. I'm gonna like, oh, Vershawn. Clearly, there are 3 points that you just hint to without naming them as such. And for the benefit of the audience as well, what you're alluding to, this idea of flipping the script, basically, is known in as a semantic inversion. So when you do a semantic inversion, when you flip the word, so the shit becomes really amazing, and you know, even the N word, for that matter, it has when you use it in a semantic inversion way. So you flip the meaning from the negative to the positive, and I think in your conversation, in your explanation, you hit also on Du Bois' notion of the double consciousness. So this idea of code switching as well. So you're almost a kind of a bilingual. Using language in a bilingual way. And the last thing that is really interesting in your articulation is Martin Luther King was asked one time when in the midst of the civil rights movement, whether he was defeating his cause by being too adamant, too strong in his argument, standing up the way he did, and so on and so forth. And that just reminds me of the email that you received. He was asked one time, Martin Luther King was asked one time, and in a kind of really it's just stunning way, the anchor of the program, she kept asking him whether he was doing, why is he doing what he was doing? Is as if to say, the emails that you have received are asking you to say, are asking you, why are you making this argument? Why can't I use it? And it has at least it resonated with me in the ways in which Martin Luther King was asked the question. So it's really interesting in that sense. But I want to hint or move into the idea of always within the usage of the N word. And you kind of alluded to it, but I would love to hear your ideas more in terms of at what point or is it ever permitted? And I know you gave one answer, but I would love to hear more answers around it. The outsiders are allowed to use the N-word. At what point, or is it ever permissible to use the N-word? Let me make it even more concrete. Eminem was asked one time why he never uses the word, the N-word, and he said, it's just off limit for me. It's just off limit. Are you making a similar argument, or are you taking it differently, or how are you thinking about this idea of the insider and the outsider?
You know, I'm going to give you an answer to this question, but I'm also going to ask you if you would share your perspective on the question as well. And I know that you do work on and have done research on high school students and their, especially African high school students in Canada, and their acquisition and use of what you call Black English style or Black stylized English, of which they borrow from hip hop, and the N-word has to be one of those borrowings. So I'll ask in a moment, you know, what your take is But yes, my take is similar to Eminem's, Slim Shady's. He says, and has said several times, that the N-word is not in his vocabulary. Now, of course, it's part of a vocabulary that he has access to, but
Right.
what it means is that I am deliberately choosing not to use it, even as I perform quite successfully in a genre where others, Black people, use the word quite frequently. And I applaud that perspective. So I do take that perspective. I believe that this is, as I tried to point out earlier, that this is a term that in a casual, everyday sense is off limits to non-Black peoples. I also try to indicate that in a classroom setting, it is not off limits. So there are different uses, right? There's the cultural use, and then there's what I would call the school use or the academic use, where it is appropriate for any teacher, depending on their, whatever their background is, be able to teach texts, refer to texts, and quote from texts that use the N-word and to say it. So I'm making those two distinctions, but I believe quite firmly that that outside of the quoting and outside of the direct referencing, the euphemistic term, the N-word, should be used, and even I use it. That's my argument.
Okay. Before I give my my take on the whole topic, I would, since we're talking about Eminem, I would love to hear your take on the hip hop, the whole genre of hip hop. It's a broad scene, just way too inclusive and too broad to kind of talk about hip hop. It is like as if we're talking about one thing. But just for the sake of argument, let's talk about the hip hop and the use of the N-word in particular. And whether should all hip hoppers do the same thing as Eminem, or are they can they even spit anything without the N-word?
Well, I am generally I'm generally quite liberal in my understanding of people's use of language. In other words, I'm not a language police. I don't believe in language policing. I am way liberal in the kinds of access to language that people can draw from, the cultural references and so forth. Eminem stands out in this particular conversation because he's the only rapper hip hop artist, white rapper hip hop artist, that this has even come close to being a significant topic because of the genre that he most often performs in. But I want to say two things. One, culturally speaking, to stay on the Eminem example before I move to a larger answer, Eminem's rap and hip hops are really about white lower class culture. Those, we like it and we can vibe to it, and he draws from and brings in, Black culture and has a style that's influenced by it. But his main topics are really about what white discursive meanings. For example,
right.
In his album, The Real Slim Shady, when he creates the character that's going to be, that considers murdering his mother, Black people in general don't rap about that. I mean, it doesn't even arise to our conscience. There is a place in Black culture specifically about the role of the mother, mama, that is just off limits. I mean, Tupac, has a famous song that he sampled from a whole group about mama. That isn't an iconic Black referent that helps us to understand the distinction between Eminem's white cultural rap and black rap. There are differences in the subject matter. Now, hip hop itself on language, specifying language, I think that it is a wonderful, fruitful, enormously rich genre when it comes to language. Because, and I'm thinking about this particularly both on a meaning level, but also on a performance level.
Right.
Performance level, the virtuosity that is needed in order to spit rhymes and the intelligence that is showcased when you're spitting rhymes or going up to the mic. It's dynamic. It's unfortunate, though, I think you might agree with me on this. It's unfortunate that schools and the academy do not value that kind of intellectual display of language and that virtuosity in classrooms. It is a real shame because it is so powerful and deep and extraordinary, and people and educators know it because they can't do it.
Exactly.
That exhibit that kind of performance of language. It is at such a high level that they are often afraid of it, really.
And they don't know what to do with it.
They don't know what to do with it. And part of doing something with it, a note for educators, is to allow it to exist and be
right.
So that we can become into familiarity with it. That's what we do with it when you don't know. But it is an example of exclusion. It is an example of racism to disallow that kind of intellectual demonstration of language use and performance, to disallow it from being a part of what is asked for and being able to demonstrate an acquisition of knowledge in classrooms. It just is. Students who come from hip hop culture and who are influenced by hip hop culture, it cuts them off at the knees before they even begin to walk. Because language is so important to knowledge acquisition and so important to the demonstration of knowledge that to say that those forms of language displays are off limits when that is a really rich way of performing, it's just really a problem.
And all I can do is just snap my finger, and this is the time when I'm showing my shirt.
Yes.
Oh, there you go.
Yes. It's the lineage, funk, soul, hip hop.
I know, right? But Vershawn, you're hitting on, and you're looking at the person who made one of the earliest arguments linking and using the language of curriculum and curriculum studies, linking it and making the argument for why we need to think, why we need to pause with hip hop, linguistically, culturally, sociologically, historically, all the aspect of it. And one of the main arguments that I've been making over the years is that we have the best historical record ever in hip hop. We have the absolute most amazing, don't tell me Gilles Deleuze or Michel Foucault or whomever. We have the best social theorist, cultural theorist in hip hop, if we pay attention to it. And this is the last chapter I just finished with Tupac, making exactly this argument. Three arguments. One is making the argument that youth are our new cultural theorist. Hip hop is extremely rich historical record. And three, most amazing, linked directly to what happened to George Floyd, the trauma of forecasting one's own death. So this is the most it's almost prophecy if we pause, listen to it, know what is attempted to be done and in and through it. Let me and I know the floor is all yours, but it's just you asked me a little bit of a question a little bit earlier about the people that I work with and the students that I work with. I work primarily looking at the process of immigration, and the population that I work with are the recent continental Africans who arrived in both in the U.S. as well as in Canada, and what I've been doing over the last few years, is actually more than 15 years now, is documenting the process of what it actually means to immigrate while Black. What does it mean to immigrate while possessing a body that speaks louder than we want to say? What does it mean to immigrate while possessing a body that is already read, already signified, already historicized, already mythologized? So how do Black immigrants negotiate that historical umbrella of Blackness as existing in North America? Unfortunately, we missed the first two waves, the first two Black immigration waves, particularly from the Caribbean in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s, to document them from a social science perspective. So what I've been doing is documenting the everyday experience, or what I call the ground up kind of work, by detailing, by ethnographically living the experience of what it actually means to go to school while learning English, while possessing this body, while encountering the police for absolutely no reason other than we're looking for a dark man with a dark bag. Guess who encountered that? This body. The police stopped me in Toronto for no reason other than he said, we're looking for a dark man with a dark bag. And so what I'm doing here, very briefly, is it's kind of detailing what I've been working on in relation to the N-word in particular. There is almost, first of all, Black English for this population that I work with becomes a kind of a symbolic space of identification. It becomes the space where they find themselves, where they negotiate their sense of identity, where they kind of start to immerse into what it actually means to kind of being familiar with the history of Blackness in North America overall. And so in that sense, to become Canadian or to become American for Black immigrants is to become Black. In other words, then we move from Blackness as a verb to Blackness as, Blackness as a noun to Blackness as a verb, as a category that we perform every day in our bodies, in the ways in walk, talk, and so on and so forth. And in that sense, one of the main arguments that I've been doing is looking at what complicating through the experience of documenting these young people, complicating the category of Blackness, and hence the title of my book, The Rhizome of Blackness. And here, and I'm just gonna say this and then close it with that, the rhizome of Blackness is looking at the complexity, the multinational, multilingual, and kind of ever-shifting category of Blackness itself, which leads me to the last category. And I know people we are almost with time. People would love to hear more about your take on the relationship, the broad relationship, now that we discussed everything, the broad relationship between race and language. And here I'm thinking about Stuart Hall, who argues that race works exactly like language. It speaks. It has a phonetic system. It has a morphological system. It has a particular way of pronunciation. It's phonetic. It has its own syntax. So I'm wondering, Vershawn, as we close kind of our reflection, you and I, whether you can speak a little bit, since you gave a lot of thinking to the N-word and the use of language and the code switching and all of this. What's your take on the relationship between race and language?
I have so many takes because that's such a broad category. I think that I think that they are intricately intertwined, not only metaphorically related, race and language. Let me say a couple things about race and language, and they may be a couple distinct things that overlap. One thing about race and language is that we, in certain variations of language, are racialized. For example, we've been talking about what some linguists call Black English vernacular, or African American English, or Black English as a structured, rule-governed language.
Right.
And so that obviously, because it's called Black, is associated with Black people, right? Their language practices and habits. But we don't identify and name, say, for instance, terms like Standard English, right? It to have a neutral referent, one that's unraced. But linguists will tell you that Standard English, as we know it, is patterned after an edited up version, not their cultural version, but an edited up version of middle class white peoples in the States, Midwesterners, for instance. So in that sense, language is raced both in cultural settings and in school settings. And what happens in a school setting, for instance, when a Black person who uses Black English vernacular or African American English comes to school, they are then asked, this is why my shirt says I'm too proud to code switch, to change one language habits that's raced into another raced language pattern that is given the facade of neutrality. Many, in my research, I've uncovered that Black people understand what they're being asked to give up. They're not being asked to just attain an academic language set of practices. They are asked to give up race. They are asked to give up Blackness, whereas people who are more aligned with the group, racially aligned, are not asked to give up race. They're not asked to give up that performing or that becoming, as you might call it, a racialized Black person when they go to school. That's a relationship between race and language. I'm against that divide, right? Thus, I don't ask students to code switch. I don't code switch. I use all of my language habits as a resource. The other thing about race and language, I said I want to say a couple things, and this will be the second, is that historically there's an understanding about what language applies to what groups of people. For example, in the US, the preamble to the Constitution says that all men are created equal. Now, you have the writers, the framers, as we often call it, the founding fathers, who said all men were created equal, but their understanding of that language construction was not me and my ancestors who were in the US. We were not part of all men. So even though it's not race, even though they don't say all white men are created equal, that's what the understanding was. So there are racialized understandings, even of our foundational texts in our cultures, Canada included. One example in Canada I'm thinking about is Sir John A. Macdonald's pronouncement that Canada is a white man's country and always will be. He was much more explicit.
Yep, he was.
in his language about that. And we see that being the case as well. And that's sort of led to the need for a multiculturalism policy in the 70s, one that is often critiqued as well. But there are these things that come up against this historical language use that seems neutral, but is deeply, deeply racialized. I'm just going to gloss this with this example. Ask, for instance, could something like what happened at the Capitol building on January 6th in the US happen in Canada?
Mm-hmm.
I've read some people's response like, yes, because there's a hyperbolic use of language. People are using hyperbole and so forth. Or hyperbole in and of itself is not a problem. Hyperbole is a rhetorical device, right? Guys, if I'm getting ready to eat lunch and I said, my God, I'm famished, I'm being hyperbolic. I'm not really starving, right? I ate breakfast, but I may have had an exercise or did something that made me extraordinarily hungry at this moment. So I use hyperbole, I'm famished. Hyperbole is not the issue. The issue is what I just pointed to, how some people understand the values as they are articulated through the language of the land, the language of our cultures, as applying to some people and not to all.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened at the Capitol was an understanding that the articulation of the values of Americanness are really for whites and not for others, that they are the ones that you might say that they are the primary beneficiaries of those values. And that is what they were protesting against, really, right? And that's why they point to the same language to say, this is our Constitution, this is our thing, even though they're creating a divisive situation. The same thing can happen in Canada.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't capitalize on our multicultural sense of understanding that the values apply to all people equally, that equity is about diversity and inclusion. That means that how we articulate values applies to everybody that's here.
Right. Okay, I think we're ready to receive questions. I don't know if Anj has any questions. The Q&A, just for the benefit of the audience, there is the Q&A, and you definitely more than welcome to pose and make comments and stuff like that. And Anj will help us to ask questions. And if we have, it looks like we have a few questions, about 7 of them. So I just would love to hear, Anj, and if you have any specific questions addressed to Vershawn or to the conversation itself.
Hi, yeah, thank you. The first question is from an anonymous attendee, and they ask, they say, thank you for enlightening me about the black body acknowledgement. Could you provide some information on when this was created? Have you seen it being used at organizations widely?
So I think there's some historical iterations of the black body acknowledgement. I think at least in Toronto, I think the city of Toronto acknowledges in its land acknowledgement at the end a recognition of slavery and a recognition of Black peoples historically. That's one kind of example. Excuse me. I have been encouraging the example that I deliver today in order to keep in the forefront the assault that happens on Black and brown bodies in North America. And the reason, and that acknowledgement that I gave today, along with instructions on how to create and use Black body acknowledgements, are in the book that Jim said, quoted from me at the top of this hour, which is This Ain't Yesterday's Literacy, Culture, and Education After George Floyd. It's one of the culminating activities in that book. But I have been stunned by my colleagues' lack of knowledge about Black oppression and anti-Black racism. Many of my colleagues as we were discussing, and many of my white colleagues talked about their lack of understanding because it's not their experience, or they didn't know or weren't aware of the extent of the problem that the protests for George Floyd murder brought to fore. And I have to tell you, I was stunned. Because I happen to think to not be ungenerous, I happen to think that anyone who says that has cultivated some kind of racial ignorance, because these things have been in the media for a long time. And we can only go back a few years to Trayvon Martin or Michael Brown. And the reason why Trayvon Martin is important is because Obama weighed in on that argument and it blew up. The media, everybody knew about Trayvon Martin's problems and President Obama saying he could have been his son. So the Black Body Acknowledgements is a way to say that, to keep these issues in the forefront and to make a commitment to intervene into them, instead of being receivers of this information after the fact and saying, I don't know what to do, which I think unwittingly perpetuates oppression. I also wanted to stand in contrast to the Native American land acknowledgements, because I think that I would like to see my colleagues do more with those acknowledgements. Instead of simply uttering those acknowledgements, say what we're doing to account for the assault on Native peoples. What's our commitment to justice for Native peoples? Our commitment cannot simply be a recitation of a land acknowledgement. That certainly does something, but it doesn't go far enough.
Wonderful. If I can just add to what you just said, by the reaction that you and I are witnessing in terms of people are stunned by the anti-Black racism, it points to how the system worked. The system worked exactly as it was intended, which is people not taking their ignorance seriously. And in that sense, you cannot talk about what you do not know. If I'm leaving it up and over, leaving it out over and over again, then you get to know certain things. And that is what people know. And so we can't imagine, we can't talk, and we can't even teach what we do not know. And that's why this moment is so enlightening to so many people, because all of a sudden there is this kind of a fog that is just like, ha. So it's really, really interesting what you just said. And I know we have a few other questions as well.
Yeah, the next one is from AK, and AK asks, how do approaches to language differ amongst different English-speaking Black people? For example, African Americans versus an African immigrant from an English-speaking state. Do their approaches to race and language differ?
Awad.
I knew you were going to do that. Of course, we in this sense, we need to complicate the very category that we're talking about, the very idea of language itself. And here I am using the Saussurean language, where it's just this form of communication. It's a kind of a medium of communication. So it's a very structured, very standardized kind of, there is that form of language that we all know about, which is known as school language. But then there is this other form and other format of language, which is what I call the semantic language. And here we're talking about the cultural ways in which people walk, talk, and do things with language. And those are two different things. There's clearly there is just a systematic mechanism of knowing the language, knowing how to master the language of power. And here I'm talking about just knowing how to structure sentence and speaking a kind of a notion in a clear way. But there is other aspect, and this is where my own work had been intending to do, is to look at how do people access this systematic language? Where do they invest into the language itself? How, what do they end up taking up, leaving out? And what is the kind of the different ways in which people do that? And so with the continental Africans, in particular the youth that I've been working with, they don't look to the mastery of the language. Language becomes a kind of a symbolic way, an invocation of where they want to locate themselves racially, culturally, linguistically, and so on. So they would drop words that like AAVE in particular, African American Vernacular English, and they would drop it exactly as it's performed in the African Canadian context or African American context, but they do not look to the mastery of the language. It's invoked. It's a symbolic way of locating oneself politically, socially, and culturally, as if to say, I and I black too. So in that sense, then there's two languages that we're talking about here. But I know in your case, Vershawn, you have a particular way of working with this, particularly from a literary perspective.
Yeah, but I just want to go back to you for a second, because in one of your articles, Awad, you talk about continental Africans coming to Canada, and they're bringing with them at least 3 languages,
Right.
2 or 3. They have a home language or African-based language. They may know French, they may know English.
Mm-hmm.
How do they negotiate the use of language? Do they mix those languages together? When you say that they're not overly concerned with mastery, for instance, that they're not overly concerned with even mastery of African-American English, right?
Mm-hmm.
English, they use it as invocation, as a performance and location. Do they mix in other languages, language in their use?
Right, they do. And here I have 2 different contexts, particularly in Ontario. You have, I was working in English language schools and French language schools. So in the French language schools, Vershawn, you would be surprised that they come in with the full mastery of the language itself. In fact, there's something really, really ironic about, particularly in the French language, they come with Parisian French. So all of a sudden, they are almost like the school itself is shocked as to what to do with them. Because here they were, quite a number of them were refugees and coming from East Africa, West Africa, and different parts of the continent. And they're supposed to be a source of pity, and yet they come in with Français Parisien. What's the whole essence of the school is about, and so they enter what I call in one of the articles deceptive fluency. And what I mean by deceptive fluency, as if to say, oh, you speak such good French, you master the French so well. There's something deceiving about the way in which you master that language. So your fluency is deceptive in that you're not supposed to. and there's your argument about the racialization of language.
And who it belongs to, who is supposed.
Not who belongs to it and
Yeah.
who doesn't.
Yeah.
So
So from a sociolinguistic perspective, I have not studied non-African American speakers of Black English as you have, Awad. My subjects are primarily African American English users. And in my, what I have seen is that they mix in, at least in school environments, as well as outside of school as well. They mix their African American grammar and rhetoric or styles of language when they perform academic tasks in school. So their Black English comes out. It is there, even in instances where they try to suppress it. It's just present. That's a linguistic phenomenon that many people should understand, that your home language called L1 or language 1, the first language, always breaks through that target language, which they refer to as language 2 or L2. It's always present. That's how we can say that someone has an accent and identify where they're from, even though they're not speaking that particular language. It's the influence of that language into. That's what happens. That's why I promote code meshing, bridging these, instead of asking writers and speakers to give up that heritage, which I say is impossible. I would imagine that this would extend to other speakers of other languages, right? That they write and use, or as one scholar, Charles Coleman, calls it, thinking about students, he says, our students write with accents, right? I would say that this extends to all students, but some accents we don't mark. It's go unmarked, as Awad was saying here. And so they are not asked to give them up. Some are privileged. Some Eastern European accents, languages are not, when they're marked in the L2, they're not asked to give those up.
Right.
But if they are attached to a stigmatized racialized identity, usually there's the ideology that their accents or their language uses that are problems in schools, problems in workplaces.
And I don't know, Ange, if we can have more than one question so that we can make use of the time. If not, we can hit the next question if you have one.
Okay, I'll just keep going through as much as we can get to. Yeah, the next one is from Henry. Why and how should accented ways of knowing, such as Black style English or hip hop poetry, be given more space in academia?
Vershawn.
Well, how should it? Was that the question, Ange? How should it?
Yeah, I believe it was how and why. Sorry, I already moved it.
Well, you know, the why answer is because it's the right thing to do. I mean, schools are places where we reinforce what it means to be human. I mean, really think about it. Academic institutions are about maintaining and sustaining humanity. Even the sciences, all of what we do is based upon a greater, deeper understanding of what it means to be human. Medicine, even law, all of these things, and how to structure society. So we do a disservice when we don't have multicultural examples of what it means to be human, of people actually performing and living. We must make space, not just more for Black ways of knowing and being. That, I think, is essential in North America, because you don't really have an American culture without Black culture. And we just misunderstand that in America so much. That's why in America, we really need to have a Black culture. And I would say that influence carries over into Canada. Here, it may be way more important if we were comparing, and I don't really want to compare, but I would say to do more on being inclusive of Native literatures, examples. Because I don't think you have a Canadian culture without Native ways of knowing and being, and French ways of knowing and being as well. We need more multicultural literature and performative examples of being human taught regularly as a part of the baseline curriculum in the academy, from K through all of the elementary school grades, in secondary school and in college.
And you got that right, Vershawn. The simple answer is if we, and this is like a given in all the research that we've been looking at. If the starting point for any pedagogy is where the students are at, to do otherwise is to already judge, not judge, but literally deciding to fail those students. If you don't start with where they at, the culture they have, the language they speak, the pedagogy of place that we started this talk with, if you don't start here, then you as an educator, you decided to fail those students. It's just straight up. You know, like it doesn't even need a second thought into this. So this is just straight up, right? Anj.
Yep, sorry. Yes, the next question is from Ranjith. Language is political. It's also very violent, especially against Indigenous, Black, and racialized people. Phrases such as blackmail, black mark, black sheep versus whitewash are some examples of violence in this language. It's also about the particular language being used, English in this case. Terms like poverty, inequality were not even concepts in many Indigenous languages. My question is this: how do Black people navigate this inherent violence of English language and reclaim the same violent forms for building solidarities and for resurgence?
Wow, I think this is your question, Vershawn. Really.
Oh, you do? I was going to say the same thing.
That's pretty much all of your work. Like it's just yeah.
Yeah, I think that Black people, as I've said earlier, use language, the shared language, right? The language that Blacks and whites share, but Black people use it. They increase the levels of meaning, right? Mm-hmm. So that the violence of, say, like we talked about earlier, the N word, Black people share that word, but they've increased the levels of meaning, right, for their own purposes. That goes to the second part of that question, which is how do they negotiate language for their own purposes? That's one way, right, to use those shared words, but to create meanings, rich cultural meanings that increase the possibilities for what it could mean, which also means challenging, right? By that very performance challenges that violent iteration, in this case, the N-word. The other thing is that many people, oppressed peoples, tend to pull the cover off of these terms to really show what they mean. For example, urban. Urban is a term that stands in for Black, or Black and brown people in underclass or very lower middle class environments. That's what urban means, even though in education sociological senses when that term is used. And many, especially scholars who are racialized, pull the cover off of that and say, well, what do you mean by urban? Urban cannot, we have to really sort of understand and unpack what you're saying, and why is it that there's a deliberate obfuscation of a people or of language there in using urban. So I think that we have to pay very close attention to the ways in which language is used and understand the racial connotations of language.
Awesome. And
yeah, the next one is from an anonymous attendee, and they say, this has been an excellent conversation so far. Thank you. I agree with them. My question revolves around how we identify and refer to Black people as a group. We know race is a social construct, but when we use the term racialized, it appears only to refer to Black and other non-white people. Do you see any issues with that? Racialized, visible minority, historically disadvantaged. What, in your opinion, is the best way to refer to Black people in a way that is most respectful of recognizing our dignity and doesn't suggest inferiority?
Well, Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no,
Well, the first thing is to be in community and contact with Black people. That's the first thing.
Okay.
A lot of people, a lot of academics that I work with, and a lot of white people that I know, can actually spend their whole day not encountering Black people. And
Our whole life. I mean,
I'm sorry, I would say
their whole life, not just
their whole life even, right? Unfortunately.
Yep.
And unfortunate for me, I can spend my whole day not encountering any other Black person besides my family or myself, which is it's a real issue. So I think we need to increase our contact and interaction with people unlike ourselves. Once we do that, then we need to give them agency to be able to tell us how they want to be referred to. Because not all Black people are not homogenous.
Mm-hmm.
Some Black people prefer to be called African Canadian. Some want to be called African American. Some want to be called Black.
Mm-hmm.
Some don't, it doesn't matter to them whether it's Black, African American, or otherwise. But these are not impolite conversations. These are conversations that we can have with people, or listen to the way in which they refer to each other and themselves. And that is how we could adopt a language of reference. This isn't a one answer fits all sort of thing. It shows the complexity of language use and even racial designations.
And no, but it's you're hitting on exactly what I'm referring to in my book, the title, The Rhizome of Blackness. It's exactly the multiplicity, because I don't want to judge the question itself, but the question itself assumes there is a one-off or like a kind of an entity, whereas you and I and our work is to trouble that unidimensional ways in which we're looking at Blackness, and looking at it rhizomatically would automatically and the rhizome here is the plant, and the plant goes in different ways. It's just like my fingers now. It goes up and down. It goes this way. And it takes different shape, and it has different, and it receives the sun, it receives the snow, it receives the water, it absorbs it differently, and so on and so forth. So this is the metaphor that we should work about when we talk about Blackness. Let's keep in mind the multiplicity, and one way to address the multiplicity is paying attention to it, acknowledging it. And so the very acknowledgement is to say, like there are different, like even if you're not totally sure about what to call, you can start by preambling what you want to say, by saying, this is a complex category, and acknowledging its multiplicity in different ways. However, I'm using this way for this purpose and for this reason, and so on and so forth. And then they continue the conversation without feeling that you're paralyzed not to talk at all, or not to say anything, because not to talk and not to say anything is exactly defeating what you are suggesting, Vershawn, the listening, the paying attention to.
That's right. That's right. These things operate relationally, even though sometimes we talk about them singularly or distinctly. For example, language is a relational act. It is always relational, which means that speaking requires a listener. Doesn't mean it has to be an outside listener. This we can talk, in academic terms about intrapersonal communication, but it still requires a listening. We need to talk about not only about speakers of language, but who's doing the hearing, who's doing the listening, and what frameworks they're listening through, and how they may have to adjust their frameworks in order to hear, more properly. what's being said. The same thing with writing. It requires a reader. It could be the self or others, but what are the frameworks, of reading? So it's an interrelationship. And I point this out to also say, I usually use the term white when I refer to white racialized individuals, because instead of referring to mainstream, which doesn't give the race to the people that operates under white supremacy. And by the way, it doesn't mean that just because we live in a white supremacist society that every person is a white supremacist. It means that we have access to the ideologies of white supremacy that fuel and run our societies, right? We just have to understand that white people are closer to the group that has installed white supremacy, racially speaking, right? So instead of saying terms like mainstream for whites, I say white people. Instead of saying terms like standard, I use the term white standard English, because that is what it refers to. So we have to, I believe white people have to be more comfortable being racialized as white, and unpacking what that means. Once white people do that, this act of understanding their racialized subjectivity, then we can move in anti-racist ways, because then they can understand, oh, this isn't just neutral. This isn't just normal. This is racialized, and it's disseminated as normalized, but it really refers to a historical white identity. That's how we move forward. That's how we uncover how language can perpetuate racism and use language in anti-racist ways.
That's you snap your finger. I'm very mindful of the time, but you hit it right on. And my last comment is more like, is there an average nigger?
Did you say average?
Yeah, well,
here's the thing. You're referring to the title of my first book, but look.
Exactly.
I have to tell you this quick story before we end. I was stunned into becoming a scholar of Blackness. It wasn't my first go-to. I was teaching at a university. I was teaching writing, and this is before I got my PhD. I was in the midst of getting it. And one of my students wrote a paper titled Your Average Nigga. And he was from, a lower class environment. And here I am trying to be this like professorial English professor. And he writes this in his paper. And I was like, immediately I was brought into a conflict. What do you do? How do I negotiate this? I think, to answer the facetious question, yes, because he was referring to an average nigga, so there must be one. And I think that in a Black cultural sense, yeah, of course, right? I thank you for asking that.
I know. I got to drop it in, man. I know. Our time is up, and I just want to say, what a pleasure it was, Vershawn, to be in conversation with you. And I think Jim is ready to say a few words for the audience. And thank you so much for sticking with us. More than 100 people, and I think we reached 141 at some point. So thanks, everybody. Jim, the floor is yours.
Well, I just want to thank the two of you. I thought this was a remarkable discussion, the content, the insight, your openness and sharing your views. It was truly excellent. One of the questions that did come in had to do with people who would like to share this with their students or with others. And I would just point out that a recording of this, a video podcast of this, will be posted on the CFE website, likely tomorrow afternoon, if not tomorrow afternoon, on Thursday. So if you want to see this or share it, go to CFE cfe.ryerson.ca. That's our website, cfe.ryerson.ca, and just click on events and go to this one, and you'll see it. You'll also see our upcoming events, of which there are a number. We deal with a lot of different topics in the center, topics related to freedom of expression, the public's right to know, and as Vershawn said, expression is about both the saying but also the hearing. We're going to be looking at, on February 3rd, Wednesday, February 3rd at 4 o'clock, we have a panel discussion on facial recognition. And the title of it is Facial Recognition, a Pathway or a Threat to Our Future. That's Wednesday, February 3rd at 4 p.m. A week later at February 10th at 4, we're having a panel that's looking at privacy, protecting privacy in the digital age. And then finally, the next week, Thursday, February 18th, we're having at 4 o'clock again, we're having a panel on Canadian authors and books and endangered species. So if you want to see the information about these events or any of our other events or our past events, we've had over 50 or 60 events over the last few years. They're all on our website, again, cfe.ryerson.ca. I really want to thank again our panel, our speakers today. It was a magnificent conversation, I thought, and I want to thank, as Awad did, I want to thank our audience for joining us, and we hope you'll come back for other discussions. So thank you very much.